The evening began like any other. Daniel's key turning in the lock echoed down the hallway as he entered, setting his briefcase down near the stairs and loosening his tie. "Violet, I'm home," he called out, his voice heavy from a long day. From the kitchen came her response, light and upbeat. "Dinner's almost ready," though the tone seemed just a bit too lively. Daniel hesitated, but quickly dismissed the thought as he walked toward the living room. Their 17-year-old daughter, Megan, was lounging on the couch, absorbed in her phone. Without looking up, she muttered, "You're late again," her irritation unmasked as her thumb swiftly typed. Daniel frowned, the lack of a proper greeting leaving a bitter feeling in his mouth. "Nice to see you too, Megan. How was school?" he asked. Megan barely glanced up, responding flatly, "Fine." He sighed and shook his head. "Could you put your phone down for a minute? I'm trying to have a conversation." Megan finally raised her eyes, rolling them dramatically. "Why? It's not like you're ever around." The words stung, but Daniel managed to keep his face neutral. Despite working long hours for the sake of his family, the comment hit harder than he expected. Before he could respond, Violet appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Dinner's on the table," she said with an overly bright tone. "Let's eat before it gets cold." Daniel followed them into the dining room, the tension in the air already palpable. The table was set as it always was, and the smell of roasted chicken filled the room. Daniel sat in his usual spot, Megan to his left and Violet across from him. They served themselves in silence, the clink of utensils on plates the only sound. Violet broke the quiet first, her voice polite but casual, like a hostess engaging in small talk. "How was work?" she asked. "Busy," Daniel replied. "We have a big project deadline coming up." Violet nodded, her gaze not meeting his, her phone beside her plate vibrating softly. She glanced at it briefly, before quickly looking away. Megan smirked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like Mom's got a secret admirer." Violet's head snapped up. "Megan, that's enough," Daniel said, his tone calm but questioning. "What does that mean?" "Nothing," Violet quickly answered, her smile forced. "Just Megan being her usual self." Megan shrugged, indifferent. "Whatever." The rest of the meal passed in tense silence. Daniel's mind raced as he picked at his food. The odd cheerfulness from Violet, her secretive behavior with her phone, and Megan's sharp remark all gnawing at him. But he said nothing, choosing to let it go for now. After dinner, Daniel offered to do the dishes, a gesture that usually earned him a smile or thanks from Violet. Tonight, though, she merely nodded before disappearing into the living room. Megan followed her, phone in hand. Daniel stood at the sink, listening to their muffled voices and occasional laughter from the other room. But a feeling of unease refused to leave him. Violet's laughter seemed forced, and Megan's voice carried a note of amusement that felt out of place. Later that evening, as Daniel headed upstairs to their bedroom, he passed Megan's room. The door was slightly open, and he caught a glimpse of her sitting on her bed, scrolling through her phone. She didn't acknowledge him as he walked by. When he entered the bedroom, he found Violet already in bed, her back to him, her phone resting on the nightstand, glowing faintly. She appeared absorbed in whatever she was reading. "Long day?" Daniel asked, trying to bridge the gap between them. "Yeah," Violet replied, still facing away. "I'm just really tired." Daniel hesitated before leaning over to kiss her cheek. "Good night," he said softly. "Good night," she murmured, her attention still on the phone. As he climbed into bed, he couldn't shake the unease that had been building all evening. Something was wrong, and he was determined to uncover it. The house was eerily quiet when Daniel awoke. The clock on the bedside table read 2:43 a.m. He instinctively reached for Violet's side of the bed, but the sheets were cool. Frowning, he sat up and listened. A faint voice drifted up from downstairs. He quietly slid out of bed and tiptoed toward the door. Muffled laughter echoed from below. His brow furrowed, and he moved cautiously toward the staircase, avoiding the creaky step. When he reached the bottom, the dim glow from the living room lit up the hallway. He paused, hearing Violet's voice more clearly now. "Oh, stop it," she said in a playful, almost flirtatious tone. Daniel's stomach knotted as he crept closer, staying in the shadows. Through a partially open door, he saw Violet sitting on the couch, her laptop on her lap, her face illuminated by the screen. She was laughing, her expression animated in a way he hadn't seen in years. You're terrible, she giggled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The name Mr. Patterson appeared on the screen, and Daniel's heart sank. Isn't that Megan's school principal? He whispered to himself. His mind raced as he watched Violet lean in closer to the screen, lowering her voice in a conspiratorial way. He couldn't hear the words, but her body language spoke volumes. The way she smiled, the way her hand lingered on her collarbone, the way she laughed. It didn't feel innocent. This wasn't casual. This wasn't friendly. Daniel clenched his fists, feeling a mix of anger and betrayal. For a moment, he considered confronting her, but something stopped him. He needed proof. Quietly, he backed away and went upstairs. In their bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. His breath was shallow, his chest tight with emotion. He glanced at the empty space on Violet's side of the bed, the void feeling like a chasm. The next morning, Violet acted as though nothing was amiss. She hummed as she made breakfast and offered him a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. "Sleep well?" she asked, her smile bright and casual. "Fine," Daniel replied, his tone forced. He studied her face, searching for any hint of guilt or unease, but she met his gaze briefly before turning back to the stove, perfectly at ease. Megan walked into the kitchen, complaining about needing to borrow the car for a group project. "You can take it," Violet said, barely looking up from her work. Daniel watched them quietly, his mind still replaying the events of the night before. Over the next few days, Daniel's suspicions grew. Violet's phone buzzed constantly, and she seemed more distracted than usual. Whenever Daniel entered a room, she quickly locked her phone or shut her laptop. Her movements were too deliberate to be coincidental. One afternoon, while Violet was out running errands, Daniel decided to take action. He found an old USB spy camera from a past work project and carefully set it up in the living room, angling it to capture the couch and coffee table where Violet frequently worked. He also installed a monitoring app on his phone to track any activity. That night, he stayed up late, pretending to work in his office. Around midnight, he heard footsteps on the stairs and waited a few minutes before opening the app. The live feed from the living room camera showed Violet on the couch with her laptop open. Moments later, Mr. Patterson appeared on the screen. Daniel's stomach churned as he watched Violet laugh and lean closer to the screen, her gestures, expressions, and tone full of intimacy. His heart raced as he recorded the session, each second pounding in his chest. The following day, while Violet was out, Daniel accessed her phone, having memorized the passcode. Her mother's birthday. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Explicit messages, photos, and plans for secret meetings with Mr. Patterson. One message read, "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again this weekend." Another said, "Daniel's clueless. He's always working late. We've got nothing to worry about." Rage clouded Daniel's vision as he scrolled through more messages, finding hotel reservations and candid photos of Violet that turned his stomach. His hand shook as he set the phone down, breath coming in short gasps. When Violet returned later that afternoon, she greeted him with her usual smile. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, leaning in to kiss his cheek. Daniel pulled away slightly. "Fine," he said, keeping his tone neutral. He didn't trust himself to say more. Violet frowned, sensing something was off. "Everything okay?" "You seem off." "Just tired," Daniel replied. "Work's been crazy." She nodded, seeming satisfied with the explanation, but Daniel's mind was already racing. He knew he couldn't confront her yet, not until he had everything he needed. In the following weeks, Daniel carefully collected evidence, setting up additional cameras and keeping an eye on Violet's phone activities. With each new discovery, his sense of betrayal grew deeper, each finding adding to the ache in his chest. One evening, Megan's behavior pushed him to the edge. She had been particularly dismissive, mocking him for being dull and too strict. He suppressed his frustration, realizing that she had no idea what was happening. Or did she? The thought lingered in his mind, but he chose to ignore it for the time being. By the end of the month, Daniel had accumulated a significant amount of proof, videos, screenshots, and text logs, everything he needed to confront Violet. She wouldn't be able to deny the truth. The weight of the betrayal threatened to consume him, but he wouldn't let it defeat him. Instead, he focused on the actions he had to take. One night, lying in bed beside Violet, Daniel stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. The woman he had built his life with, the mother of his child, had shattered his trust in the deepest way. Yet, as painful as it was, he felt a strange clarity. He knew what he had to do. For the entire week leading up to this moment, Daniel had prepared meticulously. Every detail had to be flawless. The living room was neat, and the atmosphere deceptively calm. This tranquility contrasted sharply with the emotional storm about to unfold. He sat on the couch, his posture stiff, the evidence neatly arranged on the coffee table. Violet and Megan entered together, their faces showing curiosity mixed with mild annoyance. "What's this about?" Violet asked defensively, her eyes darting to the papers in front of him. Megan plopped down onto the armchair, scrolling through her phone without a care. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Sit down, both of you," he ordered. Violet frowned but complied, sitting at the edge of the couch. Megan sighed loudly, slouching further into the chair, her arms crossed. "Dad, if this is about me using the car last night—" "This isn't about the car," Daniel interrupted coldly. He turned his gaze to Violet, his heart pounding but his resolve unwavering. "Violet, why don't you tell Megan what you've been up to?" Violet's face twitched, a flash of panic crossing her features. "What are you talking about?" Without a word, Daniel grabbed the stack of printed messages and threw them onto the coffee table. The papers scattered across it, forming a damning display of betrayal. Violet's eyes widened as she recognized the texts, photos, and emails. "Explain this," Daniel said, his voice cold as ice. Violet reached for the papers with trembling hands, her face draining of color as she skimmed the incriminating evidence. "Daniel, it's not what it looks like," she stammered. Daniel's voice rose, his anger finally surfacing. "Those messages are explicit. Hotel bookings, photos, it's all right there. Don't insult my intelligence." Violet opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Megan, meanwhile, had put her phone down and was watching with a mix of confusion and irritation. "What's going on?" Megan asked. Daniel looked at her, his frustration spilling over. "Did you know about this?" Megan rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "So what if Mom needed a little excitement? You're so boring, Dad. Always working, always tired. Maybe if you paid more attention to her." Daniel's composure snapped. He slammed his hand on the coffee table, making both Violet and Megan jump. "Boring? Megan, I've worked tirelessly to provide for this family. The house you live in, the car you drive, the clothes you wear, everything. And this is how you repay me? By defending her?" Violet tried to intervene, but Daniel cut her off, his disbelief evident. "Talk? You want to talk now? After sneaking around behind my back with Megan's school principal?" He pointed at the papers. "You've humiliated me, Violet. And worse, you've betrayed the trust that this family was built on." Megan stood up, her posture defiant. "You're overreacting. Mom made a mistake. Big deal. You're acting like this is the end of the world." Daniel stared at her, his anger now laced with profound disappointment. "Overreacting? Do you even hear yourself, Megan? This isn't just a mistake. This was a conscious, selfish choice. And you stand here defending it." Megan opened her mouth to argue, but Daniel raised his hand to silence her. "You know what? I'm tired of your attitude, Megan. You've been disrespectful, ungrateful, and now this." He turned to Violet. "And as for you, I've got one more thing to address." He stormed out of the living room and into his office. Violet and Megan exchanged uneasy glances, the tension thick in the room. Moments later, Daniel returned with a manila envelope in hand. He stood before them, holding the envelope out like a judge delivering a verdict. "I didn't want to believe it at first," he began, his voice steady but cold. "But after everything, I had to be sure." Violet's face went pale. "What is that?" she asked. Daniel's words cut through the silence like a knife. "DNA results." He tore open the envelope and pulled out the papers, tossing them onto the table. "Proof that Megan isn't even my biological daughter." The room fell silent. Megan stared at the papers, her face a mix of confusion and disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "You heard me," Daniel replied, his voice unwavering. I'm not your father, Megan. Your mother's lies go deeper than I ever imagined. Violet's eyes filled with tears. Daniel, please don't you dare, he snapped, his voice icy. I spent years raising Megan, loving her, thinking she was my daughter. And all this time, you knew. You knew, and you said nothing. Megan's defiance crumbled as she looked at her mother. Is this true? She asked, her voice trembling. Violet reached for her, but Megan recoiled. Megan, I can explain. Explain? Daniel cut in, his voice rising again. There's nothing to explain. The truth is right there, in black and white. You lied to me, Violet. You lied to both of us. Megan's eyes welled with tears as she stepped back. You knew all along, Mom. How could you? Violet broke down, covering her face with her hands. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I was young. I made mistakes. Mistakes? Daniel repeated bitterly. This wasn't a mistake, Violet. This was a betrayal. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Both of you need to pack your things. I want you out of this house by the end of the day. Violet looked up, her face streaked with tears. Daniel, please, we can fix this. Don't do this. Megan joined in. I didn't know, I swear. Don't kick me out. Daniel's expression hardened. You made your choice when you defended her, Megan. And you, he pointed at Violet, destroyed any chance of reconciliation the moment you lied to me. He turned and walked away, their pleas following him down the hall. For the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of betrayal was heavy, but the clarity it brought was liberating. This marked the start of a new chapter, one where he would no longer live under the shadow of lies. The morning after Violet and Megan left, the house felt eerily quiet. Daniel stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty coffee maker, feeling a wave of strange calm. The storm had passed, but the wreckage it left behind wasn't his to clean up anymore. With a renewed sense of purpose, he poured himself a cup of tea and sat at the dining table. Revenge was no longer just an idea, it had become a plan. Over the next few days, Daniel contacted his lawyer and set the divorce process in motion. Violet was served papers at her temporary motel room, a sharp contrast to the luxurious home she had been forced to leave. The legal proceedings were swift, and Daniel ensured the prenuptial agreement he had insisted on years ago would leave her with nothing more than the clothes on her back. Megan, by default, had to follow her mother's lead, as Daniel legally severed any claim she might have had to his estate. Violet and Megan were unprepared for the harsh reality awaiting them. Violet tried to plead her case to friends in the community, only to discover that Daniel had already exposed her affair with Mr. Patterson. Word spread quickly, and the judgment was swift. Friends stopped answering her calls, invitations dried up, and even casual acquaintances avoided her. Mr. Patterson fared no better. The school board held an emergency meeting, and within a week, he was dismissed from his role as principal. His career was ruined. Megan, meanwhile, struggled to adjust to a life far removed from the comforts she had once taken for granted. The dingy, cramped apartment Violet had managed to rent was a far cry from the spacious home they had once shared. Megan lashed out at her mother, blaming her for everything. You ruined everything! She screamed one evening, throwing her phone onto the sagging couch. We had everything, and now look at us. Violet, exhausted and defeated, snapped back. You think this is easy for me? I made mistakes, yes, but your father didn't have to do this. You wanted to punish us. Megan shook her head. Maybe if you hadn't lied to me my entire life, we wouldn't be here. Back in his now quiet home, Daniel was thriving. The initial sting of betrayal had turned into a drive to rebuild his life. He began hitting the gym regularly, a habit he had neglected for years. He reconnected with old friends, attending poker nights and barbecues that reminded him of the joy of camaraderie. He rediscovered hobbies he had abandoned, woodworking, hiking, and even photography. One day, while hiking a nearby trail, he met Kelsey. She was sitting on a boulder, sketching the landscape in a well-worn notebook. Her easy smile and warm demeanor caught his attention. They struck up a conversation, and soon enough, Daniel found himself looking forward to their chance encounters on the trail. Kelsey wasn't just kind and intelligent. She was grounded. Everything that felt like a stark contrast to his past, in contrast to the turmoil he had left behind. Daniel's relationship with Kelsey developed naturally, without any secrets or hidden motives. One evening, as they sat together for dinner, Daniel opened up about his past. I didn't think I could ever trust anyone again, he confessed, his voice tinged with vulnerability. But meeting you has changed that. Kelsey gently placed her hand over his, offering reassurance. We all carry scars, Daniel. It's how we heal from them that shapes us. Meanwhile, Violet's situation was continuing to worsen. Her attempts to find a job were met with rejection and whispers about her affair. Mr. Patterson, now unemployed and shunned, stopped returning her calls. Feeling isolated and desperate, Violet came to Daniel's doorstep one evening, tears streaming down her face. Daniel, please, she pleaded. I made mistakes, but I'm still the mother of your child. Can we at least talk? Daniel didn't flinch. You're not the mother of my child anymore, Violet. That ended the moment you lied to me. Her voice cracked as she begged. I have nowhere else to go. Megan won't even speak to me anymore. Please, I'm begging you. Daniel's expression grew cold. You made your choices, Violet. Now you have to live with them. Goodbye. He closed the door, and her sobs were muffled on the other side. For the first time, Daniel felt no guilt, only a sense of closure. His life was moving forward, and he wouldn't let the past pull him back. Months later, Daniel and Kelsey stood together on the patio of his newly renovated home, watching the sunset. She leaned against him, her presence a comforting weight. You've come a long way, she said quietly. Daniel smiled, genuine warmth in his expression. I have, and for the first time in years, I feel free. As the sun set, Daniel realized that he had found something more than freedom. He had found a future worth living for. The months passed, and Daniel's life continued to improve. He had firmly closed the door on his past, but it wasn't long before the past came knocking, literally. One evening, he heard a desperate, insistent pounding at the door. When he opened it, he found Violet and Megan standing there, worn down by hardship. Violet collapsed to her knees, gripping Daniel's pant leg, her tears flowing freely. Daniel, please, she sobbed. I made a terrible mistake. I was foolish, and I destroyed everything. Please give us another chance. Behind her, Megan stood awkwardly, her once arrogant posture replaced by a meekness Daniel had never seen. Dad, I was wrong, she said softly, her voice lacking the sneering confidence it once held. Please don't leave us like this. Daniel stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. Do you really think it's that simple after everything you've done? Violet sobbed harder. I didn't know what I was doing. I was selfish. I know. But I've paid the price, Daniel. I've lost everything. Megan stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I know I was awful to you. I said things I didn't mean. I've been miserable without you, and I just want to come home. Daniel took a slow breath, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind him. Home? You want to return to the life you threw away? The life I built while you disrespected and betrayed me? Violet grasped his arm, her voice rising in desperation. I've learned my lesson, Daniel. I swear I'll be better. Megan will be better. We'll make it work this time. Megan nodded quickly. Yeah, Dad. We'll do whatever you want. Just don't leave us out here like this. Daniel's eyes moved between them, his gaze cold and unwavering. Do you remember the day I showed you those messages, Violet? The evidence of your betrayal? Do you remember what you said? Violet lowered her head, her voice barely a whisper. I said it wasn't what it looked like. Daniel turned his focus to Megan. Do you remember what you said, Megan? Megan swallowed hard. I said you were boring, and that Mom needed excitement. Daniel crossed his arms. And now you want me to believe you've changed? That you suddenly respect me after months of insults and lies? Violet grabbed his hand, her fingers trembling. People can change, Daniel. I've changed. I had to. Life without you, without your support, has been unbearable. Daniel pulled his hand away. Unbearable? Because you lost the comfort and stability I gave you, not because you truly regret your actions. You didn't change, Violet. Life changed for you, and now you're scrambling to undo the damage you caused. Megan began to cry softly, wiping her cheeks furiously. Dad, I don't want to live like this anymore. I don't want to fight with you. I miss how things used to be. How things used to be. Daniel's voice rose slightly. You mean when I was the only one working to make this family work while you both mocked me behind my back? When you felt entitled to everything I gave you without a shred of gratitude? Violet raised her hands, pleading. I know we were wrong, but doesn't everyone deserve a second chance? Please, Daniel. Daniel took a step back, his expression hardening. Second chances aren't given out like free candy, Violet. They're earned, and you've done nothing to earn mine. Violet's sobs turned into hiccuping cries. You can't just turn your back on us. We're your family. Daniel shook his head. Family is built on trust, loyalty, and respect. You shattered all three. And Megan, he said, turning to his daughter. I gave you so many chances to fix your attitude, to show me even the smallest bit of appreciation. But you didn't care until it affected you. Megan stepped forward, her voice trembling. I care now, Dad. I swear I do. Daniel's tone was final. It's too late. You both made your choices, now you have to live with them. Violet clutched his arm one last time, her voice breaking. Daniel, please. He pulled away and stepped back toward the door. Goodbye, Violet. Goodbye, Megan. I hope you figure out how to fix your lives. But that's not my responsibility anymore. He shut the door firmly, blocking out the sound of their pleas. For a moment, Daniel stood in the silence of the foyer, his heart heavy but resolute. He had given them everything, and they had thrown it all away. He owed them nothing. As he returned to the living room, he found Kelsey waiting on the couch, her expression calm but concerned. Are you okay? She asked softly. Daniel nodded slowly. I am. For the first time in a long time, I truly am. Kelsey smiled and reached for his hand. You did the right thing, Daniel. He squeezed her hand, a small smile playing on his lips. I know. And now I can finally move forward. Outside, Violet and Megan stood in the cold, the weight of their actions finally sinking in. They had begged for mercy, but Daniel's response had been clear. There was no going back. With Violet and Megan out of his life, Daniel felt a sense of liberation he hadn't known in years. For the first time, his home was quiet, peaceful, and free of the constant tension that had hovered over him like a storm cloud. Even as he moved forward, the scars of betrayal remained, a reminder of how far he had come. Daniel's mornings now had purpose. He had picked up jogging, a habit he hadn't kept since college, and the rhythmic pounding of his feet on the pavement became a daily ritual. On one of his runs, he met Kelsey, a woman whose grace and confidence while running caught his attention. Their initial meeting was brief, a friendly exchange of smiles and small talk about the weather. But over the weeks, their paths crossed more often, and their conversations moved from casual to personal. One sunny Saturday morning, Daniel decided to strike up a longer conversation. You seem to know these trails well, he said, jogging alongside Kelsey. She smiled. I've been running here for years. It's my escape. Escape from what? He asked, curious. Kelsey paused before answering. Life, mostly. We all have our struggles, right? Daniel nodded, feeling a connection. Yeah, we do. Some more than others. As their friendship grew, Daniel opened up about his past, his failed marriage, the betrayal, and the pain that had shaken him. Kelsey listened without judgment, her empathy shining through. You've been through so much, she said softly. But you're here now, and that speaks volumes about your strength. Over time, their bond deepened into something neither of them expected. Kelsey brought warmth and understanding into Daniel's life, things he hadn't realized he was missing. She encouraged him to return to hobbies he had long abandoned, such as woodworking and photography. Together, they explored new restaurants, attended local events, and even took a weekend trip to the mountains, where they hiked and watched the sunset from a cliffside. Meanwhile, whispers about Violet and Megan occasionally reached Daniel's ears. A former neighbor mentioned seeing Violet working a minimum-wage job at a grocery store, her once polished demeanor replaced by weariness. Megan, too, was struggling. She had dropped out of college and was reportedly living with Violet in a cramped, run-down apartment. The contrast between their current lives and the privileges they once took for granted was stark. One evening, while sitting on the porch with Kelsey, Daniel shared what he had heard. Do you ever feel guilty? Kelsey asked gently. her hand resting on his. Daniel thought for a moment before answering. No, he said firmly. They made their choices. I gave them everything, and they threw it away. They have to live with the consequences. Kelsey nodded. You're right. But it's still okay to feel conflicted. You're human. Daniel appreciated her perspective but knew he couldn't dwell on the past. His life with Kelsey was a new chapter. One filled with love, respect, and mutual support. They built a home together, seamlessly blending their lives. Kelsey's presence was a healing balm, helping Daniel rediscover joy and trust. Months turned into years, and Daniel's transformation was complete. He was no longer the man weighed down by betrayal and resentment. He had taken control of his life, refusing to let the actions of others dictate his happiness. One day, while cleaning out an old storage box, Daniel came across a family photo from a happier time. Before the lies, before the heartbreak. He stared at it for a long moment, then set it aside. It was part of his story, but it no longer defined him. Violet and Megan's lives remained a stark reminder of the consequences of their actions. Violet, once the center of attention in social circles, was now invisible, her reputation ruined. Megan, who had once mocked Daniel's discipline and hard work, now struggled to make ends meet. Her arrogance had turned to regret.